A small girl in tattered clothes pushed open the heavy glass door of Marcello's café on a bitter winter evening in Manhattan. Her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Her fingers, red and trembling from the cold, clutched a battered violin case against her thin chest. She approached the owner with a voice barely above a whisper and asked if she could play her violin for just a glass of water. The well-dressed patrons barely glanced up from their meals, their conversations continuing without pause. The owner hesitated, his eyes scanning her dirt-smudged face and the holes in her worn shoes. But what none of them knew, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that this fragile child standing before them with dirt under her fingernails was once the youngest violinist to ever grace the stage at Carnegie Hall. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side glittered like a jewelry box that December evening, each storefront window, a tableau of warmth and abundance that seemed to mock the bitter cold, seeping through the threadbare fabric of 8-year-old Emma Rose's coat. The red wool that had once been vibrant now hung on her thin frame like a faded memory, its hem unraveling, its buttons long since replaced with safety pins that caught the light from the shop windows as she walked. She clutched her violin case against her chest as if it were the only thing tethering her to the earth, her small fingers white-knuckled, despite the cold that had long ago stolen the feeling from them. The case itself told a story of better days, its leather worn smooth in places where expensive fabric had once protected it, now held together with duct tape and hope. Emma stopped outside a French bistro, pressing her face close to the glass, watching families laugh over plates piled high with food. Her stomach cramped violently, reminding her it had been 2 days since she'd eaten anything more substantial than the half a bagel she'd found in a trash bin behind a deli. 2 days of walking, searching, surviving. She could see her reflection ghosted over the scene inside. A wraith-thin child with hollow cheeks and eyes too old for her face. Eyes that had seen too much, lost too much. The contrast was stark and cruel. Inside, a little girl about her age sat in a velvet dress, complaining about her pasta. Outside, Emma shivered and moved on. She passed a jewelry store where diamonds sparkled under perfect lighting, an art gallery where paintings cost more than most people earned in a year, a chocolate shop where truffles sat in neat rows like edible treasures. At each establishment, she paused, gathering courage, her hand reaching for the door handle before pulling back. Not yet. Not here. She kept walking, her worn sneakers leaving faint wet prints on the salted sidewalk, holes in the soles letting in the freezing slush with each step, but in her eyes, beneath the exhaustion and hunger and cold, there burned something unbreakable. Determination. Her mother had taught her that. Before everything fell apart, before the world revealed how quickly fortune could turn to ash, her mother had whispered words that Emma carried like a torch through the darkness. Your music is your voice, sweetheart. When you have nothing else, you have that. No one can take that away. So Emma walked on through the glittering streets, searching for the right door, the right moment, the courage to use the only gift she had left. Marcello's stood on the corner of Madison Avenue like a golden promise, its windows fogged with warmth and life, amber light spilling onto the darkening street like liquid honey. Emma stopped before it, her breath catching in her chest as she peered through the glass at a world that seemed impossibly far from her own. Inside, families gathered around tables draped in white linen, their faces flushed with laughter and red wine, and the comfortable certainty that tomorrow would come with the same abundance as today. A father lifted his young son onto his shoulders. A grandmother kissed her granddaughter's forehead. Waiters in crisp black vests moved between tables with practiced grace, carrying plates that steamed and smelled of garlic and fresh bread, and everything Emma's hollow stomach screamed for. She pressed one small hand against the glass, feeling the warmth radiating through it, knowing with absolute certainty that she did not belong in that world anymore. The door suddenly swung open, and Emma stumbled back as a couple emerged. The woman in a fur coat that probably cost more than Emma's entire former life, the man in a charcoal suit with shoes so polished they reflected the streetlights. They saw her immediately, their eyes traveling from her tangled hair to her dirt-smudged face, to her safety-pinned coat to her ruined shoes. And something cold flickered across their features. Suspicion, distaste. The woman pulled her purse closer to her body as they passed, as if poverty were contagious, as if Emma might somehow contaminate their perfect evening. The door began to swing closed, and Emma's hand shot out, catching it, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "Your music is your voice, sweetheart." Her mother's words, spoken in that sun-filled practice room that existed now only in memory. When Emma had been frustrated with a difficult passage, ready to give up, when you have nothing else, you have that. Emma steadied herself, straightened her thin shoulders, and pushed the door open wide. The warmth hit her face like a physical embrace, so shocking after hours in the cold that tears sprang to her eyes. The scent of tomato sauce and fresh basil and baking bread made her dizzy, and then, like a wave pulling back from the shore, the conversations began to fade. One table, then another, until the entire café had fallen into an awkward, uncomfortable silence. Every eye turned toward the doorway where a small, dirty child stood clutching a violin case, looking like she'd wandered in from another century, another world, another life, entirely. Vincent Marcello emerged from behind the counter with the bearing of a man who had spent 40 years protecting his establishment from anything that might disturb his clientele's expensive comfort. He was broad-shouldered and stern-faced, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen every kind of trouble walk through his door. He approached Emma slowly, his white apron spotless, his expression unreadable, and the silence in the café grew thicker with each step he took. Emma could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, could sense the judgment radiating from the well-dressed patrons like heat from their untouched meals. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, her whisper cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Why doesn't he just send her away? This is ridiculous." Another man folded his napkin with deliberate precision, his mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. A teenage girl pulled out her phone, as if documenting this uncomfortable moment for posterity, for entertainment, for proof that she'd witnessed something distasteful. Vincent stopped 3 feet from Emma, towering over her small frame, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear into the cold night and pretend she'd never had the audacity to enter this place. But her mother's voice echoed in her head, and her empty stomach ached, and she had nowhere left to go. Emma said, her voice small but clear as a bell in the silent room. "Can I play my violin for a glass of water?" The request hung in the air like something fragile and desperate. Vincent's jaw tightened, his first instinct written clearly across his face. No, absolutely not. This was a respectable establishment, not a charity, not a street corner, and if he allowed this once, who knew what would follow? But something stopped him from speaking, some flicker of hesitation that even he didn't understand. Emma's hands trembled as she knelt on the pristine floor and carefully opened her battered case. The latches clicked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the hushed café. Inside, nestled against faded velvet that had once been royal blue, lay a violin that told 2 stories at once. The wood was scratched and worn, the varnish dulled in places where countless small fingers had gripped it. But beneath the wear, anyone with knowledge could see the craftsmanship, the elegant curve of the scroll, the precise placement of the sound holes, the quality of the maple and spruce. This had once been an instrument worth thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, played by someone who mattered, cherished by someone who understood its value. Vincent stared down at the violin, at the child, at the trembling hope written across her gaunt face, and something shifted behind his stern expression. Perhaps it was the way her small hands handled the instrument with such reverence despite her circumstances. Perhaps it was the memory of his own daughter, who had stood just as small and determined in his kitchen years ago, insisting she would become a dancer despite his protests. Perhaps it was simply that even a man hardened by decades of business could not look at this child and feel nothing. He nodded once, a sharp, reluctant jerk of his chin, and stepped back. Emma's eyes widened with disbelief, then gratitude so profound it threatened to undo her completely. She lifted the violin from its case with hands that suddenly steadied, muscle memory overriding fear and exhaustion. The instrument seemed to come alive in her grasp, as if recognizing its true purpose after months of silence and survival. In the cafe's bright light, every detail of the violin became visible. Deep scratches ran along the back where it had been dropped or knocked against hard surfaces during desperate nights. The chin rest was worn smooth, nearly white in places from countless hours pressed against skin. A crack had been carefully repaired near the bridge, the glue line visible but holding strong. The strings showed rust at their ends, and the bow hair, though intact, had seen better days. But beneath all the evidence of hardship, the violin's true nature revealed itself to anyone who knew how to look. The wood grain flowed like water across the spruce top, perfectly quartered, speaking of a luthier who understood his craft. The purfling inlay remained pristine, its delicate lines unbroken, the scroll curved with mathematical precision, hand-carved by someone who had dedicated a lifetime to perfection. This was no student instrument purchased from a catalog. This was a violin that belonged in concert halls, in the hands of masters, in a climate-controlled room behind glass. Emma tucked the instrument under her chin with the unconscious grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times, 10,000 times, so many times that violin and body had become one entity. Her left hand found its position on the neck without thought, fingers arching over the fingerboard with perfect form. Her right hand raised the bow, adjusting her grip with minute precision that spoke of years of training, of correction, of excellence demanded and achieved. She closed her eyes, shutting out the judging faces and the uncomfortable silence and the weight of everything she had lost. She took one deep breath, filling her lungs completely, centering herself the way her mother had taught her before every performance. And then Emma Rose began to play. The first notes rose from Emma's violin like a cry from another world, sharp and crystalline and impossibly pure. Vivaldi's Winter poured into the café, and the effect was immediate and absolute. A fork clattered against a plate as someone's hand went slack. A wine glass stopped halfway to parted lips. Conversations died mid-word. Thoughts scattered like autumn leaves before a storm. The music swept through Marcello's with the force of something elemental, something that could not be ignored or dismissed or explained away. Emma's small fingers flew across the strings with impossible grace, executing runs and trills that professional musicians spent lifetimes perfecting. Her bow hand moved with surgical precision, drawing out each note with exactly the right pressure, the right speed, the right soul-deep understanding of what Vivaldi had meant when he composed this piece 3 centuries ago. This was not the tentative scraping of a street performer hoping for coins. This was not the earnest but flawed playing of a talented student. This was mastery. This was virtuosity. This was the kind of playing that made people forget to breathe. The winter wind howled through Emma's strings, bitter and fierce. Speaking of frozen landscapes and survival against impossible odds, her fingers danced through passages that should have been beyond the reach of hands so small, hitting every note with crystalline accuracy, adding subtle vibrato that made the melody weep and soar. The music painted pictures in the air. Snow falling on empty streets, bare trees bending in the gale, the desperate search for warmth and shelter and hope. Around the café, shock rippled through the audience like stones dropped in still water. The woman in pearls sat with her mouth open, her earlier disdain transformed into disbelief. The man who had folded his napkin now gripped the table edge with white knuckles. The teenage girl's phone hung forgotten in her hand, her eyes wide and shining. A waiter stood frozen with a tray balanced on one palm, tears streaming down his weathered face. How could this child, this dirty street child with holes in her shoes and safety pins holding her coat together, play like this? How could such music come from someone so small, so seemingly broken? Vincent Marcello stood rooted to the spot, his stern expression crumbling as recognition dawned in his eyes. This was not the playing of someone who had learned violin as a hobby or a passing fancy. This was the playing of someone born to it, trained in it, shaped by it from their earliest breath. This child was not what she appeared to be. She was something extraordinary, wearing the costume of desperation. In the corner booth, partially obscured by shadows and deliberately chosen for its privacy, sat Marcus Sterling. At 62 years old, he wore his wealth with the understated precision of old money. A charcoal Tom Ford suit, tailored so perfectly it seemed to have grown on his frame, a Swiss watch that cost more than most cars, Italian leather shoes buffed to a mirror shine. His salt and pepper hair was impeccably groomed, his jaw clean-shaven, his posture straight despite the weight he carried in places no one could see. But his eyes told a different story. They were the pale blue of winter ice, beautiful and cold and infinitely tired. The eyes of a man who had achieved everything the world told him to want and found it all catastrophically empty. Marcus came to Marcello's every Thursday evening at precisely 7 o'clock, a ritual he had maintained with religious devotion for 3 years, since the week after they buried Caroline. He always sat in this same booth. He always ordered the same meal, the chicken piccata that Caroline had loved, though he rarely finished it. He always dined alone, turning down Vincent's gentle offers to seat him at a larger table where he might join other regulars. The loneliness was not accidental. It was intentional, habitual, a penance he paid weekly for still being alive when the only person who had ever truly known him was 6 feet underground in a cemetery he could not bear to visit. His penthouse overlooking Central Park was a mausoleum filled with her things. His corner office at Sterling Capital Management was a glass cage where he moved billions of dollars with the emotional investment of someone playing solitaire. He existed. He did not live. He had raised his water glass to his lips when Emma's music began. And for the first 3 notes, his mind was elsewhere, calculating quarterly returns, composing emails, thinking about nothing and everything except the present moment. Then the 4th note hit him, and the 5th. And suddenly the music was no longer background noise but a living thing that reached into his chest and wrapped frozen fingers around his heart. The water glass slipped from his hand. It hit the table and tipped, water spreading across the white linen in a dark stain that Marcus did not see. He could see nothing but the small girl in the tattered red coat, and he could hear nothing but the music pouring from her violin, and his hands began to shake as memory crashed over him like a wave he had spent 3 years trying to outrun. Marcus's shock was different from the others in the café, sharper and more visceral, because he did not simply recognize extraordinary talent. He recognized this specific playing, this exact artistry, and the recognition sent him spiraling back through time to a moment he had locked away in the deepest chambers of his memory. 5 years ago, on a crisp October evening, he and Caroline had sat in the 3rd row at Carnegie Hall, her hand warm in his, her body still strong and vital, neither of them knowing that the cancer was already whispering through her cells like a thief in the night. They had come to see a phenomenon, a miracle that the music world was calling the youngest virtuoso in history. Emma Rose Hartley, 3 years old. The child had walked onto that vast stage in a white dress, her tiny hands barely able to hold her violin, and when she played, the entire hall had fallen into reverent silence. Caroline had wept openly, tears streaming down her beautiful face, her hand gripping Marcus's so tightly her rings cut into his skin. She had leaned close and whispered, "This is what angels must sound like." And it was one of the last perfect moments they would share before the diagnosis came 2 months later and began the long, brutal march toward the end. Marcus stared at the girl now, his mind refusing to accept what his ears already knew. It could not be. It was impossible. That child, Emma Rose Hartley, had come from the Hartley dynasty, a family of musicians as wealthy and established as Marcus's own banking lineage. Her mother had been the celebrated violinist Rebecca Hartley, a woman who commanded $50,000 per performance and lived in a Fifth Avenue mansion that made Marcus's penthouse look modest. The child had worn designer clothes and been driven in limousines and been destined for a life of privilege and acclaim. That child would be 8 years old now, exactly the age of this girl standing before him. But that child could not possibly be this child, this hollow-eyed waif in a safety-pinned coat with dirt under her fingernails and holes in her shoes. And yet the playing was identical, unmistakable, as unique as a fingerprint or a voice. Marcus's hands gripped the edge of the table as the impossible slowly, inexorably, became the only explanation that made sense. As Emma's bow moved across the strings, her mind drifted away from the café, away from the watching eyes and the judgment and the desperate present, floating back to a time when the world had been filled with light and music and love. She remembered the Hartley mansion on Fifth Avenue, all limestone and tall windows. Rooms so vast her small footsteps had echoed against marble floors. She remembered the music room on the third floor where sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows each morning, turning her mother's hair to spun gold as Rebecca Hartley stood beside her, guiding her small hands across the strings with infinite patience and pride. The room had smelled of lemon polish and rosin, and the walls had been lined with photographs of her mother performing in every great concert hall across the world. Emma remembered rehearsals that felt like play. Her mother's laughter when Emma mastered a difficult passage, the way Rebecca would sweep her into her arms and spin her around, both of them dizzy with joy. She remembered performance halls with their velvet seats and crystal chandeliers, the rush of walking onto stages so grand they seemed to stretch into infinity, the applause that washed over her like warm rain. She remembered interviews with elegant journalists, recording sessions in studios with engineers who spoke to her like she was an adult, being called a prodigy, a miracle, a gift to the music world. Then came the night that split her life into before and after. Her mother driving home from a benefit concert in the rain, the truck that ran a red light, the phone call that her father answered at 2 a.m, his scream that woke Emma from dreams she would never have again. Rebecca Hartley died on impact 2 years ago, and with her died everything Emma had known. What no one outside their home understood was that her mother's medical bills from a childhood illness had left debts that her father, James Hartley, had hidden behind pride and shame. The mansion, mortgaged, the inheritance, drained. Her father, a gentle man who had managed Rebecca's career and lived in her radiant shadow, crumbled into grief and guilt and rage at a universe that could take someone so vital. He turned to bottles that promised forgetting and delivered only deeper darkness. Emma watched him disappear into himself, watched strangers in suits seize their home, watched their possessions sold at auction to pay debts no one had known existed. 6 months ago, her father simply vanished, leaving a note that said only, "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I cannot be what you need." Emma had been alone ever since. Emma's playing shifted as memory and present merged into one aching moment. The Vivaldi faded seamlessly into something new, something that belonged only to her. It was the piece her mother had composed specifically for Emma on her 6th birthday, titled simply, "For My Little Light." A melody that began in darkness and slowly, achingly, climbed towards something that might have been hope. The music was a story told without words, each note a brushstroke, painting loss and love, and the terrible, beautiful persistence of the human heart. It spoke of a child's grief, of nights spent alone and afraid, of hunger and cold and the weight of carrying on when everything said to give up, but woven through the sorrow were threads of gold, moments where the melody soared upward, reaching for light, for memory, for the love that death could not erase. Tears streamed down Emma's hollow cheeks as she played, her small body swaying with the music, pouring everything she had left into these notes her mother had written for her in a sunlit room that no longer existed. But she did not stop. She would not stop. Every person in Marcello's sat transfixed, frozen in a moment of shared humanity that transcended class and comfort and the careful walls people built around their hearts. A young mother at a center table pulled her daughter close, pressing her lips to the child's hair, suddenly viscerally aware of how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all be taken. Vincent's stern face crumbled completely, his eyes swimming with tears he had not shed since his own mother's funeral 20 years ago. His hand came up to cover his mouth as if to hold in a sob. An elderly woman in the corner dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, her weathered hands shaking, perhaps remembering her own losses, her own griefs, the music giving permission to feel what she had long buried. The teenage girl who had pulled out her phone now clutched it to her chest, forgotten, her face transformed by something she had no words for. Marcus Sterling rose from his booth like a man in a trance. His expensive meal abandoned, his careful composure shattered, he moved toward Emma slowly. Drawn by the music, and by certainty, and by something deeper than recognition. He knew who this child was. He knew what she had lost. And he knew, with a sudden clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis, that he was standing at a crossroads where his next actions would define everything that came after. Emma drew the final note out long and trembling, letting it hang in the air like a prayer or a question, and when her bow finally lifted from the strings, the silence that followed was profound and sacred. No one moved. No one breathed. The café existed in a moment outside of time, suspended between what had been and what would come next. Then, from the back corner, a single pair of hands came together. Once. Twice. 3 times. The sound was tentative at first, almost hesitant, but it broke the spell. Another person joined, then another. And suddenly the applause swelled, like a wave building toward shore, growing louder and stronger until it became something thunderous, something that shook the windows and rattled the glasses on their tables. People rose from their seats, standing ovations rippling through the small café, strangers wiping tears from their faces without shame, the woman in pearls clapping so hard her rings flashed under the lights. Emma opened her eyes slowly, looking dazed and disoriented, as if waking from a dream or returning from a great distance. Her small body swayed slightly, exhaustion and hunger, and the complete expenditure of everything inside her, finally catching up. She blinked at the standing crowd, at the tears and the applause and the transformed faces, not quite understanding what had happened and what she had done. Her hands shook as she carefully, reverently placed her violin back in its worn case, tucking it into the faded velvet with the tenderness of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. Vincent rushed forward from behind the counter, and he was not carrying a glass of water. He had a full plate in his hands, the chicken piccata that was the evening's special, steam rising from pasta and sauce and meat, garnished with capers and lemon and parsley. His eyes were red, and his voice was thick with emotion he could barely contain. "Please," he said, setting the plate on the nearest table. "Please, child, eat." Emma's eyes widened, going from the food to Vincent's face and back again, disbelief and hunger warring across her features. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She reached toward the plate with a trembling hand. But before her fingers could touch the fork, a shadow fell across the table. Marcus Sterling stood before her, his expensive suit and his tired eyes and his careful composure all stripped away to reveal something raw and human and utterly certain. Marcus lowered himself slowly to one knee, bringing his face level with Emma's, his movements careful and deliberate, as if approaching a frightened animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough that only Emma and those closest could hear. But in the hushed café, his words carried like stones dropped into still water. "Emma Rose Hartley," he said. And the name fell between them with the weight of truth and recognition and everything she had been running from. Emma's face went pale, the color draining from her hollow cheeks until she looked like a ghost of herself. Her eyes went wide with terror, genuine fear that transformed her features into something wild and desperate. She took a step backward, her hand instinctively reaching for her violin case, preparing to run and disappear back into the anonymous streets where no one knew her name or her history or the magnitude of everything she had lost. Marcus said quickly, urgently, raising both hands in a gesture of peace and supplication. "Wait. Please. I'm not going to hurt you. I promise you, I am not going to hurt you." He kept his voice gentle, soft, the tone someone might use to coax a wounded bird. "I saw you perform 5 years ago at Carnegie Hall with your mother. You played Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3. My wife, Caroline, she wept through the entire performance. She said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard." The café erupted into whispers, a buzzing hive of shock and disbelief and sudden understanding. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, fingers flying across screens, searching. seeking confirmation of what seemed impossible. A woman gasped as her screen illuminated with headlines, "Child prodigy vanishes after mother's death." She read aloud to her companion. Another phone showed a photograph of a 3-year-old Emma in a pristine white dress standing between her parents. All smiles and promise and a future that would never come. "Where is Emma Rose Hartley?" another headline asked. "Family fortune lost, Hartley child missing." The whispers grew louder, more frantic, people showing each other their screens, pointing at Emma and then at the photographs, the resemblance unmistakable despite the dramatic transformation wrought by poverty and loss. Marcus never took his eyes from Emma's face, watching the fear there, the trapped desperation of someone whose last hiding place had been stripped away. "Where are you living, child?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the question because he already knew the answer would break his heart. Emma's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into the nearest chair as if every bone in her body had suddenly turned to water. The weight of her secret breaking open, combined with the hunger and exhaustion and cold she had been pushing down for months, finally overwhelmed her completely. She stared at Vincent's plate of food, and something primal took over. Her hands shook as she grabbed the fork and began to eat, not with manners or grace but with the desperate urgency of someone starving. She shoveled pasta into her mouth, barely chewing, tears still streaming down her face. And between bites, the story poured out of her in broken fragments. She told them about the abandoned building in the Bronx where she slept, a condemned apartment complex with broken windows and no heat, where she wedged a chair against the door each night and wrapped herself in newspapers for warmth. She told them about playing on street corners but never revealing her true ability, always holding back, always playing just well enough to earn a few dollars but not well enough to draw real attention, because attention meant questions, and questions meant social services, and foster care meant losing the last thread of control over her own life. She told them about saving every penny in a coffee can, hidden under a loose floorboard. $23.16 accumulated over 6 months, hoping it would somehow be enough to hire someone to find her father, to bring back the only family she had left. She told them about the hunger, the constant gnawing emptiness that had become so familiar she sometimes forgot what feeling full was like, about stealing apples from grocery store displays and eating ketchup packets for dinner and drinking water from public fountains until her stomach stopped cramping. The café listened in stunned, horrified silence. Vincent had both hands covering his mouth, tears running freely down his weathered face. The woman in pearls sat with her hand pressed to her chest, her earlier judgment transformed into shame and anguish. The young mother held her daughter so tightly the child squirmed in protest. Marcus felt his heart breaking in real time. Each word from Emma's mouth like a physical blow, and he thought of his empty penthouse with its 6 bedrooms and his bank accounts with their 8-figure balances, and all the ways he had spent 3 years drowning in his own grief, while this child, this extraordinary child, had been fighting for survival alone in the frozen darkness. Marcus pulled out the chair across from Emma and sat down heavily, as if the weight of his own story had suddenly become too much to carry standing. He looked at this child eating desperately before him, and he saw his own pain reflected back in a different form, and he understood that some encounters were not accidents, but appointments written long ago by forces beyond understanding. "My wife, Caroline, died 3 years ago," he said, his voice steady but hollow, carved out by grief that had never properly healed. "Cancer. It took 18 months from diagnosis to the end, and I watched her disappear piece by piece while I threw money at every specialist, every treatment, every desperate hope. And none of it mattered." He looked down at his hands, expensive watch glinting, hands that had signed billion-dollar deals but could not save the one person who mattered. "We never had children. Caroline couldn't. Something in her body that just never worked the way it should have. We'd planned to adopt, had started the paperwork, looked at photographs of children who needed families. But we kept saying we had time, and then suddenly we didn't." The café remained silent, everyone leaning in to hear this man lay bare his soul. "Since she died, I have been existing, not living." My penthouse overlooking Central Park is a mausoleum filled with her clothes and her books and her things that I cannot bear to touch or give away. I go to work and move numbers across screens and make money I don't need and don't want. My company is successful and completely meaningless. I eat the same meal here every Thursday because it was her favorite, and I sit alone because everyone else feels like an intrusion on my grief. He looked up at Emma, his pale eyes shining with unshed tears. I have been hollow for 3 years, searching for something to make any of it matter, searching for a reason to do more than simply wait to die. His voice broke slightly. That night at Carnegie Hall, when you were 3 years old and played with your mother beside you, that was one of the last times I saw my wife truly happy. She held my hand and wept at the beauty. And for those 2 hours, the cancer didn't exist. Your music gave her that gift. You gave us both that gift. And I never forgot. Marcus made a decision in that moment that surprised even himself, a spontaneous leap driven by something deeper than logic or reason, or the careful calculation that had governed his life for 6 decades. He leaned forward, his voice urgent and sincere. Come home with me tonight. Just for tonight. A warm bed, a hot shower, safety. Tomorrow, we'll figure out the right thing to do. We'll find the right people. We'll locate your father. But tonight, please, let me give you what you need. Emma stopped eating, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, and weariness flooded her hollow face. A lifetime of recent hardship had taught her caution, had shown her that adults made promises they did not keep, that kindness often came with strings attached, that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had survived 6 months on the streets by being careful, by trusting no one, by keeping her secrets close and her expectations lower. I don't know you, she whispered, her voice small and frightened. How do I know you're not? She couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. How did she know he wasn't another danger in a world that had already taken everything from her? Vincent stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Emma's thin shoulder. Little one, I have known Marcus Sterling for 15 years. He has eaten in my restaurant every Thursday without fail. He is a good man, an honest man. When my daughter needed surgery that my insurance would not cover, he paid for it without my asking, without expecting anything in return. You can trust him. I promise you this. Marcus remained still, letting Emma study his face, letting her see whatever she needed to see. She looked into his pale blue eyes and found genuine kindness there, profound sadness that mirrored her own, and something she recognized because she carried it herself, understanding of what it meant to lose everything that mattered. She was so tired, so desperately, completely tired. Her body ached from months of sleeping on hard floors. Her stomach was finally full for the first time in days, and it made her want to weep. The thought of a warm bed, of safety, even for just one night, was almost too much to hope for. Emma looked from Marcus to Vincent and back again. And finally, slowly, exhausted beyond measure and beyond caution, she nodded. Marcus stood and extended his hand to help Emma from her chair, and she reached up to take it, her small fingers wrapping around his larger ones with a trust that felt both fragile and profound. She took one step forward, then another, and then her eyes rolled back in her head and her legs buckled beneath her. Marcus caught her before she hit the floor, his arms wrapping around her small body, and the moment he touched her skin, he felt the heat radiating from her like a furnace. She was burning up, her face flushed bright red beneath the dirt, her breath coming in short, labored gasps. Emma had been hiding a fever for days, pushing through it with the grim determination of someone who had no choice. But the full meal and the emotional release and the sudden safety had finally allowed her body to admit what it could no longer fight. She's burning up, Marcus said urgently, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, far less than a healthy 8-year-old should, all sharp bones and fragile limbs. Vincent, call 911. Now. Vincent was already pulling out his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed. The café erupted into controlled chaos, people pushing back chairs, offering help, someone bringing wet napkins to press against Emma's forehead. Marcus held her against his chest, feeling her heart racing like a trapped bird. her small body shaking with chills despite the fever. "Stay with me," he whispered urgently. "Stay with me, Emma. Help is coming." The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens wailing, paramedics rushing through the door with equipment and urgency. They checked her vitals, their faces growing grim, speaking in clipped medical terminology that Marcus strained to understand. Fever of 104 degrees, blood pressure dangerously low, respiratory distress. They loaded her onto a stretcher, starting an intravenous line, placing an oxygen mask over her small face. "I'm coming with her," Marcus said, his voice brooking no argument. "I'm not leaving her alone." At Mount Sinai Hospital, doctors and nurses swarmed around Emma's bed, running tests, taking samples, connecting monitors that beeped with alarming urgency. Marcus stood back against the wall, feeling helpless and terrified in a way he had not felt since watching Caroline slip away. A young doctor finally emerged from the examination, her face serious. "Pneumonia, severe. Her lungs are significantly compromised. She's also severely malnourished and dehydrated. Her electrolytes are dangerously imbalanced." The doctor looked at Marcus with something like accusation before he quickly explained he had just met her. Her expression softened to sympathy. "If she'd gone another day," the doctor said grimly, not finishing the sentence because they both understood. "Another day and Emma Rose Hartley would have died alone in an abandoned building, her extraordinary talent silenced forever." Marcus pulled a chair close to Emma's hospital bed and sat down for what would become the longest night of his life since Caroline's final hours. The machines beeped steadily, monitoring Emma's heart rate and oxygen levels, and intravenous lines fed antibiotics and fluids into her thin arm. Her face was peaceful now in medicated sleep, the fever beginning to break under the assault of modern medicine. But she looked impossibly small against the white hospital sheets, impossibly fragile. Marcus pulled out his phone and began making calls, his voice low and urgent in the quiet room. First his lawyer, Henry Chen, waking him at midnight with apologies and no room for argument. He needed information about emergency guardianship, about the legal process for a child with no present parent, about how to navigate the system quickly, then social services. Leaving detailed messages with night staff, explaining the situation, Emma's identity, the urgency of finding her father. Finally, a private investigator he had used before for corporate matters, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who was discreet and thorough and did not ask unnecessary questions. Find James Hartley. Find him fast. Money was no object. Between calls, Marcus stared at Emma's sleeping face and felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been frozen and dead for 3 years, suddenly cracking open like ice in spring thaw. This child, so talented and so alone, so desperately in need of exactly what he had to give. He had spent 3 years asking the universe why Caroline had been taken, what possible purpose her death could serve, and he had received only silence. But perhaps this was the answer. Perhaps grief had hollowed him out so that he could be filled with something new. Purpose. He felt it burning in his chest, fierce and unexpected. Around 3 in the morning, Emma's eyes fluttered open, disoriented and wild with fear. She tried to sit up, pulling against the intravenous lines, not understanding where she was or how she had gotten there. "You're safe," Marcus said softly, leaning forward so she could see his face in the dim light. "You're in the hospital. You were very sick. But you're safe now. I promise you're safe." Emma stared at him, her breathing rapid and frightened, and then something in his voice, some quality of absolute sincerity, reached through her panic. She stopped struggling. Her breathing slowed, and she believed him. Over the next 3 weeks, while Emma recovered in the hospital and then in a temporary foster placement, Marcus Sterling moved through the world with a focus and determination he had not felt in years. Sarah Mitchell found James Hartley in a rehabilitation center in Newark, New Jersey. He had checked himself in 7 months ago, finally hitting bottom after a night he could not remember, waking in an alley with Emma's name on his lips, and the terrible realization that he had abandoned the only person he had left. He had been too ashamed to reach out, drowning in guilt, not knowing that his daughter had been left completely alone, fighting for survival on frozen streets. The reunion took place in a quiet room at the rehab center, supervised by social workers and Marcus. And it was a thing of tears and apologies and desperate embraces. James Hartley looked 20 years older than his 41 years, his face gaunt and lined, but his eyes were clear for the first time in months. He held his daughter and sobbed into her hair, saying he was sorry over and over until the words lost meaning. Emma clung to him, forgiving him in the way children forgive, completely and without reservation. Even as the adults in the room understood the damage that had been done, James would need months more of treatment, intensive therapy, to address the grief and addiction that had nearly destroyed them both. He signed temporary guardianship papers with shaking hands, grateful that someone like Marcus had found his daughter, knowing he was not yet capable of being what she needed. In the meantime, Marcus's penthouse on Central Park West transformed. The guest room, which had sat empty and perfect for 3 years, became a bedroom fit for a princess who loved music. A canopy bed, with soft white linens. Bookshelves filled with stories of adventure and hope. A music stand by the window overlooking the park. Marcus hired decorators but let Emma choose colors and furniture, watching her face light up at having choices, at having a say in her own life again. He arranged for the best pediatric care, nutritionists to help her regain healthy weight, therapists to help her process trauma, and he enrolled her with the finest violin teacher in New York, with the explicit understanding that Emma would play only if and when she wanted to, that her music belonged to her alone. Marcus sat with Emma in the music room he had created for her, sunlight streaming through the windows, and he spoke words that her mother might have said if she were still alive. "Your music is yours," he told her gently, watching her hold the violin that he had carefully restored by the finest luthier in the city. "Not for anyone else, unless you choose. You never have to perform again if you don't want to. You never have to prove anything to anyone. Your gift belongs to you alone." Slowly, like a flower opening to the sun after a long winter, Emma began to heal. She played for herself now, standing by the window overlooking Central Park, drawing her bow across the strings not because she needed coins or food or survival, but because the music wanted to come out. Marcus would sit in the corner with a book, listening but not watching, giving her privacy in her art, and sometimes he would hear her laugh between pieces, a sound so pure it made his throat tight. They went to concerts at Lincoln Center, sitting in the same seats where he had once sat with Caroline, and Emma would grip his hand during the most beautiful passages. They wandered through the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Emma staring up at paintings taller than she was, asking questions that made Marcus see the world fresh again. They walked through Central Park feeding ducks, eating ice cream, doing the simple things that children should do, and that Emma had been denied. They grieved together, openly, and without shame. Emma would cry for her mother on difficult days, and Marcus would hold her and tell her stories about Caroline, and they discovered that shared sorrow was somehow lighter than sorrow carried alone. They healed together. Two broken people finding wholeness in unexpected family. Vincent's Café became their favorite spot, their Thursday evening ritual. Emma played there once a month by choice, and the café would fill with regulars who came specifically to hear her, but now she played with joy instead of desperation. Vincent always had her favorite meal waiting, and Marcus always left a tip large enough to make the older man shake his head and smile. They were building something new from the ruins of what they had lost, a family born not from blood but from choice and circumstance and the mysterious grace that sometimes comes disguised as tragedy. 1 year later, Emma Rose stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, her hands steady on her violin, her heart full instead of hollow. The burgundy velvet curtains separated her from the audience, and she could hear the murmur of voices, the rustle of programs, the anticipation that always filled this space before music began. But this time was different. Everything was different. She wore a deep blue dress that Caroline had chosen from photographs Marcus showed her, saying his wife would have loved seeing Emma in this color. Her hair was clean and shining, pulled back with a silver clip. Her cheeks had filled out, her eyes had lost their haunted quality, and when she smiled, it reached all the way to her soul. She was healthy, she was happy, she was loved. And she was not performing tonight because she had to, not for survival or obligation or anyone's expectations, but because she wanted to, because she and Marcus had organized this fundraiser for homeless youth, and she had something to say that only music could express. Marcus appeared beside her, elegant in his tuxedo, and squeezed her shoulder gently. "Ready?" he asked. Emma nodded, thinking about who waited in that audience. Her father, James Hartley, 18 months sober, sitting in the 5th row with tears already streaming down his face, so proud he could barely contain it. Vincent Marcello and his entire family, dressed in their finest. The man who had given her a chance when she needed it most. The doctors and nurses from Mount Sinai Hospital who had saved her life, Sarah Mitchell, the investigator, Henry Chen, the lawyer. People who had become family through crisis and care. And in the front row, center seat, an empty chair with a single white rose laid carefully across it, for Caroline Sterling, who had wept at Emma's music 5 years ago. Who would have loved this moment beyond measure? Whose absence made space for Emma to be here at all? Marcus had placed the rose himself before the doors opened, his hands shaking slightly, and Emma had stood beside him in silent understanding. The stage manager gave the signal. The curtain began to rise. Emma walked onto the stage she had last stood on at 3 years old, when the world had been whole and her mother had been alive, and the future had seemed limitless. She stood in the spotlight and raised her violin, and this time she played not from desperation but from gratitude, not from loss but from love, not from an ending but from a beginning. Emma's performance brought the house down. She played pieces her mother had loved, pieces she had discovered herself, and finally, the composition Rebecca Hartley had written for her daughter, now expanded and matured through Emma's own experience of loss and redemption. When the final note faded into the vast space of Carnegie Hall, the silence lasted 3 heartbeats before the entire audience rose as one. The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. Wave after wave of applause that seemed like it would never end. People weeping openly, shouting bravo, their hands coming together in thunder. Emma stood at center stage, tears streaming down her face, bowing again and again. And then Marcus Sterling walked onto the stage beside her. He took her hand, and together they approached the microphone. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, explaining how a small girl had walked into a café one winter night and changed his life forever. Then Emma, her voice clear and strong, announced the creation of the Emma Rose Foundation, dedicated to helping children in crisis access arts education, to ensuring that no child's extraordinary gifts would be lost to poverty or circumstance or despair. The audience erupted once more, and as the applause finally began to fade, something remarkable happened. This true story of a girl who asked for water and a man who learned to live again, reminds us all of a simple truth that we forget too easily in our comfortable lives. Everyone we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about. That child on the street corner asking for help might be extraordinary in ways we cannot imagine. That one act of kindness, something as simple as a glass of water, a moment of genuine attention, a willingness to see past appearances to the human being beneath, can change a life forever. Sometimes angels come to us in tattered coats, not golden wings. Sometimes miracles happen in cafes, not cathedrals. And sometimes, when we are hollow and broken and searching for meaning in the ruins of our own grief, helping someone else is what finally makes us whole. Emma Rose and Marcus Sterling built a family from tragedy. They found purpose in pain. They transformed survival into service. And it all began with one small girl, one battered violin, and the courage to ask for kindness from strangers who became everything. The lesson is clear. Look, really look at the people around you. Listen. Really listen when someone asks for help, because you never know when that moment of attention might save a life, or change your own, or reveal that the person you thought was asking for charity was actually offering you salvation.